He spoke of blood in the streets, of cities engulfed in fire, of kings brought to their knees and empires collapsing in silence. For more than 4 centuries, his words have echoed through moments of darkness, from the fall of monarchies to the rise of wars and plagues. To some, his name represents prophecy and insight. To others, it's a symbol of fear-mongering and pseudoscience. But regardless of what you believe, one fact remains. When the world teeters on the edge of chaos, people always return to Nostradamus. And perhaps they return because, deep down, we want to believe someone saw it all coming. Michel de Nostradam, known to history as Nostradamus, was born in 1503 in the south of France, an era torn apart by disease, famine, and religious conflict. Europe at the time was a place of suffering and superstition, where reason had not yet eclipsed fear, and death was a daily presence. He was trained as a physician and became widely respected for his work during outbreaks of the plague. Unlike many of his peers, he advocated for hygiene, clean air, and quarantine, ideas far ahead of his time. But Michel was more than a man of medicine. He was a scholar, an astrologer, and, as some believed, a mystic. He claimed that during long hours of solitude, he experienced strange visions, images of distant times and places, flashes of events not yet occurred. He saw fire consuming cities, floods washing away nations, and the fall of great leaders. He believed these visions were messages, glimpses of a future that could not be stopped. In 1555, he published the book that would define his legacy, Les Prophéties, the Prophecies. It was a cryptic collection of nearly 1,000 4-line poems, written in a dense coded mixture of languages, French, Latin, Greek, even Occitan. Each quatrain hinted at events yet to come, though none were dated, and almost none mentioned names. They were puzzles, meant perhaps to protect him from persecution, or to obscure truths too dangerous to speak plainly. Some scholars believe Nostradamus deliberately masked his meanings to avoid charges of heresy from the Catholic Church. Others argue that the ambiguity was intentional, a literary device that allowed his followers to see whatever they wanted to see. And then, of course, there are those who believe he was simply a fraud, a clever poet whose riddles were never meant to predict anything at all. But his legacy endures, precisely because his words refuse to rest. Each time disaster strikes, someone finds a verse that seems to match. A fire, a war, a name hidden between the lines. Michel de Nostradam was born in the winter of 1503 in the small town of Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, nestled in the sun-burnt hills of southern France. His family was of Jewish descent, though they had converted to Catholicism in a time when doing otherwise was dangerous. France, like much of Europe, was gripped by plague, war, and religious fanaticism. The old world was dying, and no one could see what might replace it. Nostradamus grew up surrounded by superstition and silence, and yet his early education was far from mystical. He studied Latin, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. He enrolled in the University of Montpellier to become a physician, one of the most prestigious paths a man could follow in the 16th century. But Nostradamus was no ordinary doctor. When the plague returned to southern France, killing thousands, most physicians fled. Nostradamus didn't. He traveled from village to village, treating the sick, burying the dead, and recording what he saw. He recommended clean water, fresh air, and hygiene, common knowledge today but revolutionary at the time. He also prescribed rose pills and herbal remedies, earning a reputation as both a healer and a heretic. But there was another side to him. Late at night, he gazed at the stars, studied ancient texts, and claimed to receive visions of the future. He believed that history moved in cycles, and that patterns in the heavens could reveal what was still to come. By the early 1550s, Nostradamus had begun to write down what he saw, not in journals or reports, but in verse. Cryptic, dense, poetic verse. In 1555, he published the first edition of what would become his most famous work, Les Prophéties, the Prophecies, a collection of nearly 1,000 4-line poems, called quatrains, written in an obscure mix of languages. The verses were loaded with symbolism, metaphors, and ancient references. There were no clear names, no exact dates, and no explanations. To some, it was brilliance. To others, it was nonsense. Yet the book was an immediate success. It spread quickly across Europe, translated and reprinted by both scholars and opportunists. Some believed Nostradamus had tapped into a divine source. Others believed he was toying with his readers. or hiding from the church, which viewed fortune-telling as blasphemy. Still, even as criticism grew, so did his legend. He was invited to the court of Catherine de' Medici, the Queen of France. She believed in his predictions and feared what they might mean for her children. He was admired, feared, and mocked in equal measure. A man worshipped by some, ridiculed by others. But no one ignored him. Nostradamus died in 1566, in the same house where he had written most of his prophecies. According to legend, his final words were, "You will not find me alive at sunrise." He was right. He left behind no answers, only poems and questions. Among the nearly 1,000 verses Nostradamus left behind, some stand out, not because they are clearer than the rest, but because history seems to have bent to meet their words. The most famous, and perhaps the most terrifying, is the prophecy believed to have foretold the death of King Henry II of France. Nostradamus wrote, "The young lion will overcome the older one on the field of battle in single combat. He will pierce his eyes through a golden cage. 2 wounds made one, then he dies a cruel death." At the time, few paid attention. The words were cryptic, almost theatrical. But in 1559, 4 years after the publication of his book, King Henry II took part in a celebratory jousting match. His opponent was a younger nobleman. Their lances met in a violent clash. A splinter from the younger man's weapon broke through the king's visor, the so-called golden cage, and pierced his eye. The wound was deep, infected. He suffered for 10 agonizing days before finally dying. The court was horrified. Whispers of Nostradamus spread like wildfire. Had he really seen it? Or had the prophecy become real only after the fact? Another verse speaks of fire, vast, consuming, and centered on a great city. "The blood of the just will commit a fault at London. Burnt through lightning of 23's the 6. The ancient lady will fall from her high place. Several of the same sect will be killed." Many believe this quatrain refers to the Great Fire of London in 1666, more than a century after Nostradamus had died. The fire started in a bakery. It consumed over 13,000 homes, dozens of churches, and most of the medieval city. Some saw the reference to 23's the 6, 20 times 3 plus 6, as a veiled code for the year 1666. Others pointed to the phrase, "the blood of the just," as a metaphor for the religious tensions of the era. Again, the prophecy gained power only in hindsight. But it's not just ancient history. Some of Nostradamus' verses have been dragged into the headlines of our own time. In the days following the attacks of September 11th, 2001, people began sharing a verse online that seemed eerily familiar. "In the city of God there will be a great thunder, 2 brothers torn apart by chaos. While the fortress endures, the great leader will succumb. The 3rd big war will begin when the big city is burning." The problem? Nostradamus never wrote that. It was a modern fake, written by an internet user as a hoax. But the illusion worked. The language felt authentic, mysterious, and people believed it because they wanted to believe it. That didn't stop others from digging through his real verses, searching for lines that could be stretched to fit the horror of that day. Some pointed to vague mentions of 2 towers or the great new city. But nothing concrete could be found, only fragments, shadows, words twisted by fear. And perhaps that's the true power of Nostradamus. Not in what he actually said, but in what people think he meant. Because when tragedy strikes, we search for patterns. And when we feel helpless, we look for signs. Even in riddles written 500 years ago. If Nostradamus truly possessed the ability to see into the future, then one must ask the most obvious question of all: why didn't he simply say what he saw? Why didn't he provide names, dates, or precise details that could have warned humanity of the catastrophes he supposedly foresaw? Why are his writings not a map of salvation, but a maze of riddles? Throughout history, his defenders have offered the same explanation, that he cloaked his visions in metaphor and allegory out of fear for his life. Living in the shadow of the Inquisition, in a time when heresy could mean torture or death, Nostradamus may have had no choice but to speak in code. This idea, romantic and protective, paints him as a reluctant prophet, silenced by the very world he was trying to save. But the skeptics offer another theory. They suggest that Nostradamus didn't write vaguely because he feared persecution. He wrote vaguely because it guaranteed him immortality. The verses in Les Prophecies are not straightforward predictions. They are open-ended fragments of language, rich with symbolism, but devoid of certainty. They resemble dreams more than forecasts, full of fire, blood, kings, cities, towers, floods, and vague references to great men and nations in turmoil. They feel prophetic not because they point to the future, but because they can be retrofitted onto the past. This practice, known as retrofitting, is the act of applying a vague statement to an event after it happens, convincing ourselves that the match was always there. In the aftermath of tragedy, when the world is raw and aching, people turn to Nostradamus not for guidance, but for narrative. They search his verses for echoes of what they have just witnessed, and more often than not, they find them. But these discoveries are always posthumous. No one stopped the Great Fire of London because of a prophecy. No one predicted the assassination of a king or the fall of the Twin Towers by reading Nostradamus beforehand. Only afterward do the verses seem to fit, like puzzle pieces forced into place. This isn't prophecy, it's human psychology. The desire to find meaning in chaos is one of our oldest instincts. We are pattern-seeking creatures, wired to impose order where there is none. When events feel too random, too violent, too meaningless, we reach for stories that make them feel inevitable. That's where Nostradamus thrives. His writings are just specific enough to feel relevant, and just obscure enough to remain flexible. They are a mirror, reflecting whatever fear the reader brings to them. This phenomenon is amplified by something psychologists call the Barnum effect, our tendency to accept general, ambiguous statements as personally meaningful. It's the same principle behind horoscopes and personality quizzes. If a statement is vague enough, the human brain will do the rest. Nostradamus mastered this long before psychology gave it a name. He didn't write for clarity, he wrote for immortality. And by doing so, he ensured that his words would live far beyond the facts, breathing life into every disaster that followed. Even now, in the modern world of science and skepticism, his shadow persists. Not because we have proven him right, but because we still find comfort in the idea that someone, anyone, saw it all coming. We don't read Nostradamus to learn what will happen. We read him to convince ourselves that nothing ever happens without a reason. Centuries after his death, in an age of satellites, artificial intelligence, and quantum physics, the name Nostradamus still commands attention. His verses, written by candlelight in the 16th century, are now reposted on smartphones, shared on social media, and dissected in online forums by those searching for signs of what comes next. How is it possible that, in a world driven by logic and reason, the cryptic words of a medieval apothecary continue to haunt us? The answer lies not in the verses themselves, but in the fears we bring to them. In times of peace and stability, prophecies fade into the background, dismissed as curiosities of the past. But in moments of crisis, during pandemics, wars, economic collapses, or natural disasters, the hunger for answers resurfaces. Suddenly, ancient poetry feels urgent. Suddenly, the line between myth and truth begins to blur. It is in uncertainty that belief thrives. After the attacks on September 11, 2001, Nostradamus' name surged in internet searches. Fake quatrains circulated like wildfire, written by modern pranksters, but believed by millions. Even after experts debunked them, the damage was done. People didn't care whether the words were authentic. What mattered was how real they felt. More recently, during the COVID-19 pandemic, another wave of fascination erupted. Some claimed Nostradamus had predicted a great plague in the year 2020. Others believed he foresaw economic collapse, government control, even the rise of artificial intelligence. Each time the world trembles, Nostradamus is pulled from the shelves like an ancient oracle, dusted off, and made to speak again. Not because he is clear, but because he is vague. And in vagueness, we find the flexibility to mold his words to our fears. Social media has only amplified this phenomenon. On TikTok and YouTube, creators recite his quatrains over ominous music and flashing images, giving the illusion of revelation. Misinformation spreads with cinematic flair, faster than truth, louder than evidence. A few rhymed lines, a dramatic voiceover, and suddenly Nostradamus becomes a prophet of the apocalypse all over again. There is power in mystery, and Nostradamus, whether by genius or design, gave us verses that resist final interpretation. They remain forever just out of reach, close enough to provoke awe, but distant enough to avoid certainty. In this way, he has transcended history. He is no longer simply a man or a writer. He is an idea, a myth, a a reflection of our need to believe that chaos is never random, that someone saw it coming and left behind a warning. We return to Nostradamus not because we trust his accuracy, but because we crave his ambiguity. He doesn't provide answers, he provides shape, a form for our formless dread. We've examined the ambiguity, we've dissected the psychology, we've challenged the logic and questioned the intent. And yet, despite everything, a single, uncomfortable question remains. What if he was right? What if, buried beneath the cryptic symbols and archaic turns of phrase, Nostradamus truly glimpsed something that others could not? What if his warnings were not metaphors, not parlor tricks or coincidences, but veiled messages meant for those willing to look deeper? What if we've spent centuries interpreting him incorrectly, and the real prophecy hasn't been recognized yet? Some of his verses have never been matched to any known historical event. They speak of global famine, of skies darkened for months, of iron beasts that crawl across burning lands. They tell of a great silence that will fall over the earth, and of a final king who rises from the ashes of the West. To a modern ear, it all sounds eerily familiar. We live in a world that sometimes feels like a prophecy unfolding in real time. Climate disasters escalate. Wars no longer shock us. Technology evolves faster than we can comprehend. Truth itself has become unstable, drowned in a flood of noise and contradiction. In that noise, a voice from 5 centuries ago seems to whisper louder than ever. Perhaps that is the greatest fear of all. Not that Nostradamus was a fraud, but that he was genuine, and we failed to listen. We comfort ourselves by saying he was just a man, that history bends to coincidence, that no one can truly see what lies ahead. And yet, history is filled with people who tried to warn us. Warnings we ignored. There's something haunting in the idea that a physician from the 1500s might have seen more clearly than we do today, that a man surrounded by plague and fire might have sensed the rhythms of catastrophe better than all our machines and data. Maybe that's why his words survive, not because they predicted one specific event, but because they continue to predict the shape of human fear. And in that fear, we find the shadow of truth. In the end, it is entirely possible that we will never know who Nostradamus truly was, not in the way we wish to know him. We may never uncover whether he was a prophet gifted with glimpses of the future, a poet cloaked in layers of metaphor and fear, or simply a man caught between the darkness of his time and the desperate need to make sense of it all. He has been called a visionary, a fraud, a mystic, a madman. But the truth, whatever it may be, is likely far more complex than any single definition allows. Perhaps even he didn't fully understand the weight of the words he wrote, nor the strange afterlife they would live across generations. What we do know is this. Michel de Nostradamus died in 1566, in the quiet of his home, surrounded by silence, uncertainty, and the smoke of extinguished candles. And yet, more than 4 centuries later, his voice continues to echo, not as a warning we clearly understand, but as a riddle we still can't put down. His writings have survived plagues, wars, revolutions, and the birth of the modern world. They have outlived the kings and empires of his time, and they continue to appear, in moments of global panic, in headlines, in whispered conversations and viral videos, as if summoned by our collective unease. And maybe that is the point. Maybe the true power of Nostradamus was never in his ability to foresee exact events, but in his ability to capture the timeless shape of fear. Maybe he didn't write to predict the future. Maybe he wrote to preserve the emotional weather of humanity itself. Because when we look at his quatrains, we see not precise maps of what will come, but blurred reflections of what has always been. Our obsession with control, our terror of the unknown, and our endless search for meaning in a world that too often offers none. Nostradamus gave us no answers. What he gave us instead was something far more dangerous, the illusion that the future can be known. And in chasing that illusion, we reveal who we really are. Perhaps that is why we keep returning to him. Not because we believe he was always right, but because we are still afraid that somehow he might have been. And if that fear endures, then so will the echo of his words.